So, Roy, tell me a little bit about some of the struggles that you see when it comes to HIPAA, technology, all that stuff.
Well, just some of them, right?
Yeah.
So
we can talk for like 3 webinars just about the struggles.
I can. So this person had it like this, and that's really common. No, the thing I think is the biggest struggle for people is to get really theoretical about it, I think for therapists, there's like an identity issue actually around HIPAA, because when it comes to, there's a couple pieces to HIPAA, and the one we tend to have the easiest time with is what's called the HIPAA privacy rule. And that's the one where like you have to give clients the HIPAA form that's got your privacy practices on it. You know, that one? Mm-hmm. It's called the Notice of Privacy Practices, but everyone just calls it the HIPAA form. That one's pretty easy because it's just, how you're going to take care of confidentiality and what your office policies are around like getting record requests and stuff like that. That's not too weird or far from what we did before HIPAA ever came along. Right. It's just sort of different ways of doing it. We tend to do it even more tightly than HIPAA does anyways. It was never that big a deal, except you add a few new forms or something. The HIPAA security rule is the part that relates to digital tech. And so suddenly in the last 5 or so years, that's blown up as important to us because we're using the digital tech and we're putting client records on servers on the internet, all kinds of stuff like that, which is great. It's going to make our practices a lot more efficient. If you're not thinking about how to use that tech to make your practice more efficient and more enjoyable, you probably want to think about that because there's ways you can do it. But the problem is that therapists tend to have a sort of identity that says, we don't do technical things, we do human things. And so when the security rule comes along and says, okay, you need to think about encryption, you need to think about, when you're putting client information on a device somewhere, where does that information flow? Who has access to your information when you put it on a cloud service? I think therapists have a lot of resistance to taking on the idea of learning to understand that and learning to understand what it is and how to manage it the way we've always managed client security. We don't use that word, we call it confidentiality, but we've done security for decades. And like we've always been very good at it, but suddenly with the digital stuff, there's a big technical thing. And I think a lot of therapists struggle with the identity issues around thinking, can I do that? Should I do that? Is that something I should start to learn and understand?
Yeah, and I see this all the time where people are just so overwhelmed with all that there is. And this isn't even just unique to HIPAA, that when they're overwhelmed with marketing or social media, they just get kind of paralyzed by perfection. Like we want to do it right. We want to make sure that like we're good at it, but we also like don't know where to start. So maybe talk a little bit about how that overwhelm leads to avoiding.
Well, and that actually is the thing I've seen a lot is people get, as soon as people learn how HIPAA security compliance works, they go, man, this is overwhelming. Like the word overwhelming is like the most common word we hear from people at Person-Centered Tech. And my assistant, Liath, is like, she sort of like writes poems about the word overwhelm because people use it so often, right? It's a word people use a lot. And what we've discovered is that people will feel the overwhelm and then avoid. They'll just say, well, I'm not going to bother with it because I can't understand it anyways. So why deal with the pain of being overwhelmed? I mean, she's the one who first interfaces with people and helps them de-escalate from the overwhelm by showing them the resources we have that helps them get it all in order.
Yeah.
So she totally is that.
That's what helps people kind of get through that overwhelm typically is like just learn kind of the next steps. Okay.
Yeah, chunk it down, learn the next steps, right.
So in regards to struggles, tell me a little bit about that we ignore what we can't see. Because, I mean, obviously it's like if I have a counseling file and I leave it on my car and I drive away and it falls off the top, like I feel like, oh crap. But I would because I've talked to you so much, would have the same feeling of other things. But a lot of people, they don't feel that way about digital. Talk a little bit about ignoring what we can't see.
Yeah, right. So that's actually a great example because when you can see the client file, you suddenly know exactly what to do to take care of it. And if you notice that you messed up, you totally feel it and you feel motivated to fix it, like leaving the file out. None of us would ever take our file cabinet full of client files and like leave it in the street. right? You just wouldn't do that, right? Or you wouldn't hand it to some shady guy on the street who says, "I'll take care of it for you, no problem," and he winks at you. You know, you wouldn't do that.
Or like if
But
in a truck were helping you move, like you'd probably be the one that you'd like, I want my files to be in my car, not just in some random U-Haul, or I want to see it in there and know where it's at the whole time.
Exactly. And people do that. You know, we think, and we're pretty good at coming up with the right kind of security measures to take care of the stuff we can see. But when it comes to, we can't see the internet. Like, you don't physically, I can't like point at something and say, that's the internet. And we can't, and people tend not to have an understanding of like, you know, what does it actually look like physically when you put a record on a practice management system, which is in the cloud somewhere. Right? People don't really conceptualize that. And I could go into like my little analogies that help show people how when we use just any old email service, we're basically doing the equivalent of handing our client files to some guy on the street who's winking at us and says, yeah, I'll take care of this for you, wink, right?
Right.
Because, you know, whatever email service we use, those people are holding on to all the emails we exchange. But we don't know that because we don't see it.
Right.
Right. And it's not something, and very importantly, like, this is not necessarily anyone's fault, because like, it's not like in our day-to-day conversations or even in the news or anywhere we talk about tech in our lives, we go, you know, when you use an online service, there are people who maintain that and have access to everything you talk about or use. For some reason, it's just not part of our discourse. And so so you don't see it, no one talks about it, and it ends up being out of mind.
Well, I imagine it's similar to, you know, when people are paying off debt, for example. It's like when they have an envelope system with cash in it versus using credit cards, it's a lot easier. And so it's like that physical, tangible, like, okay, our food budget's, you know, $300 this month versus like just using a credit card, we ignore what we can't see. And so I think it's almost like what you're talking about, I think taps into something deeper in the brain where the things that are right in front of us, we tend to take kind of that action on, whereas the things outside of that, we don't.